Our guest on This is America in the World is Dr. Patricia Kim. Dr. Kim is a Rubenstein Fellow at the Thornton China Center and the Center for East Asia Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Kim holds a doctorate in politics from Princeton University and formerly held senior positions at the Wilson Center, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the U.S. Institute of Peace. Dr. Kim, thank you for joining us this afternoon. So good to be with you.
It's my pleasure.
When you look at China today, what do you see?
Well, China today is very much a risen power. It's a peer or near peer competitor to the United States. It's the world's most populous country with 1.4 billion people. It has the world's largest standing military in terms of active duty personnel and the world's second largest military budget. China is currently the world's second largest economy, and many analysts believe that it will overtake the United States to become the largest economy by 2030. China's domestic landscape, of course, has changed remarkably since the 1980s when it launched its opening and reform. And so hundreds of millions of people have been lifted from poverty. Chinese cities have been transformed, and you can see glitzy skyscrapers and modern infrastructure today. And with this internal transformation, China's foreign policy has also changed notably to one that's much more assertive, that seeks to showcase this remarkable development that it's undergone to the rest of the world, and to emphasize this idea that others can benefit from its rise through programs like the Belt and Road Initiative that brings Chinese infrastructure and loans to developing regions. But at the same time, I would say that Beijing not only has tried to bring public goods along with its rise, but it's also become much more aggressive about protecting and advancing its core interests, whether this is pressing its sovereignty claims over Taiwan or its claims over disputed territories against its regional neighbors in places like the South China Sea and the East China Sea.
When you talk about China and its neighborhood, and we'll put a map up on the screen, talk a little bit about how they interact with the neighbors.
Sure. So as China has become this juggernaut in the region, I think its foreign policy has become much more assertive. It really has shown this determination to showcase its remarkable development and to really send this message, especially to the developing world, that the world can benefit through its rise, through things like the Belt and Road Initiative that brings Chinese infrastructure to the region. And at the same time, Beijing has also longstanding historical disputes with many of its neighbors, and it's become much more aggressive and assertive about advancing its core interests, whether this is pressing its sovereignty claims over Taiwan or various territorial claims against its neighbors in places like the South China Sea, vis-a-vis states like the Philippines and Vietnam, or the East China Sea, where it has disputes with Japan and South Korea. So in many ways, it's become a very much assertive power in its region.
So when we're talking about the foreign policy and its rise to power, what do you think President Xi's goal is, say, 5 or 10 years from now? What do you think his mission is in that regard?
Sure. Well, I think President Xi has, he's been called one of the most powerful Chinese leaders since Mao Zedong. He's rapidly consolidated his power since assuming the presidency in 2012. And he's really put himself at the forefront of China's national rejuvenation campaign. So he's made the case that China needs a strong leader like himself to cement its status as a world-class economic, military, and technological power. And so if you see, some of the steps that he's undertaken, both at home to consolidate the party's power at home through what is known as Xi Jinping thought, and of course with himself at the helm of the Chinese Communist Party, And he's also been very ambitious by putting forth programs like the Belt and Road Initiative, which claims that China, again, will bring its development, its know-how, its loans, its infrastructure to the rest of the world. So he's a very ambitious leader.
Let's take a little break. You've mentioned Belt and Road a couple of times. So I want to clear that up for the folks at home who might not know, because this is a vast project that spans many, many countries and investments all over the world. So take a little break. We're talking with Dr. Patricia Kim, and Dr. Kim is a Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution, and her resume is the Wilson Center and the U.S. Institute of Peace. We'll talk a little bit about that on the other side. This is America and the World. Underwriting for This is America and the World is made possible by the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C., the Republic of Uzbekistan, the Sultanate of Oman, the Kingdom of Morocco, the National Association for Children of Addiction, Faces and Voices of Recovery, the Forerunner Foundation, the Rotendaro Family Trust, and the Embassy Series, Uniting People Through Musical Diplomacy. Dr. Kim, let's focus in on the economic policies of President Xi. And you've talked about Belt and Road. What is Belt and Road?
So the Belt and Road Initiative is a program under Xi Jinping that was launched in 2013, which was an initiative to export China's infrastructure know-how and its financing to create vast networks of roads and railways, ports, and special economic zones to essentially create trade corridors and export markets that would strengthen China's economic presence and its geopolitical influence in regions around the world, while also bringing economic benefits to its neighbors, which is what the Chinese like to call win-win cooperation. Now, despite its very ambitious launch and the eagerness by many developing countries to sign on to the Belt and Road Initiative since its launch in 2013, the initiative has also run into a number of snags in recent years, with complaints about the quality of infrastructure projects, environmental concerns, fears about being ensnared in a debt trap vis-a-vis China. There have also been questions raised inside China asking why the Chinese government is spending so much money abroad when there's still problems at home. So that's, it's a complex project. And over the last 2 years, I think Belt and Road, because of the pandemic and also sort of these various problems that I just mapped out, have been being scaled back. And so it hasn't quite lived up to sort of the ambitious way that it was packaged when it was first launched in the 2010s.
It's touching many countries though, huh?
Absolutely. I think China has something over dozens of partners. I think the last count I saw was 70-something countries who have signed on to this initiative, stretches from its own backyard in Asia to Africa, the Middle East, to Latin America. I believe Argentina, in fact, just signed on this week as a partner. So it very much goes around the globe.
It's kind of interesting from both an economic point of view and a foreign policy point of view that you have China investing now in South America as well. And within the country, what drives the economy? Is it a consumer-driven economy as we are here?
Well, I think China initially got its big economic growth spurt from the 1980s as a manufacturing hub. And it was very much on the low end of this manufacturing. And I think Beijing has signaled that it wants to really focus on its domestic economy, to spur innovation, to move it up the value chain. And in the last 2 years, you've seen this push towards, again, developing more sort of the inside market and less of a focus on the outside with the Belt and Road in the early in the 2010s and so on. And you've seen Chinese leaders promote what they call this dual circulation strategy. And I think Chinese leaders have made it very clear that they want their country to be at the technological forefront. And so you see programs like Made in China 2025, which are essentially state-led industrial policies and investment schemes to move China, again, from the low end of manufacturing sort of to become a technology powerhouse. And I think this is driven not just by economic concerns, but also as Beijing looks out at increasing geopolitical competition with the United States. And it has a desire not to be too dependent on the United States and its allies for vital components like semiconductors, for instance.
So foreign policy, building up the military, the economy both within the country and abroad, scaling back somewhat on Belt and Road. But this area of technology, there's really a huge push, huh?
Absolutely. I think that is very much the focus. I think Chinese leaders realize in order to stay ahead, to compete with the United States, they do need to become a technological powerhouse. I think they've seen what the United States has been able to do vis-a-vis Huawei, for instance, which is a huge telecommunications company in China that the U.S. was essentially able to cripple with export restrictions and not allowing that company to purchase U.S. technologies, U.S. hardware, and so on. And so they want to be free of that kind of dependency.
Hosting now the Olympics. China is hosting the Olympics. Is it a plus or a minus in any way, shape, or form? Take either part of that. Plus or a minus for them to be hosting the Olympics?
Sure. Well, I don't think this is the Olympics that Beijing expected it would be hosting when it first won the bid to host in 2015. I mean, at that time, there was no way for Chinese leaders to know that we'd be in the midst of a global pandemic. They probably saw the Olympics as a great opportunity to showcase China's stature on the world stage, which has, changed tremendously even since the 2008 Olympics, which were hosted in Beijing. And so they probably saw this opportunity as a triumphal way to start off an important year that will conclude with the 20th Party Congress, where President Xi Jinping is on track to get an unprecedented third term in office. Now, of course, things didn't pan out this way. And I think in many ways, the Olympics has become a liability for Beijing because the leaders have really honed in on this zero COVID policy that relies on basically stamping out any COVID cases, not living with COVID, on doing strict lockdowns and mass testing and tracing and so on. And they've really doubled down that this is the right approach. And so they've set a very high bar for themselves to try to prevent the Olympics from sparking an outbreak in their country. And so I think Beijing has struggled. It's designed a closed loop system for the Olympics that's much stricter than the Tokyo Olympics. And this has put China in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. We see a lot of stories about athletes struggling with quarantine facilities and procedures and so on. And of course, in addition to COVID-related challenges, Beijing has also had to deal with a diplomatic boycott over the Olympics, where many countries, including the United States, UK, Australia, and Canada, have chosen not to send high-level officials in order to protest against Chinese human rights violations.
And also, it's put human rights back in the news, and especially the treatment of the Uyghurs. That's Absolutely. A huge story that has been brought to people's attention by them hosting the Olympics, huh?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's been a huge spotlight put on the various human rights abuses that China is complicit in, including on persecuting Uyghurs in the Xinjiang area. Of course, Beijing has denied committing any of these abuses, and it's dismissed these boycotts as geopolitical posturing and a US-led smear campaign. But yeah, I think it's really telling. If you look at the guest list of leaders who did decide to show up, to the Olympics, it's quite striking that many are indeed from countries that are very much on the autocratic end of the spectrum.
So we have this sit down before the Olympics start with Putin and Xi. What was your takeaway of that?
Well, I think it was quite extraordinary that Xi Jinping decided to host Putin for his first in-person meeting with a foreign leader since the start of the pandemic, and to mark the opening of the Olympics, despite what's going on in Ukraine right now and the standoff with Russia. And so I think the fact that this first slot was given to Putin just shows you how much the Sino-Russian relationship has become very close. And I think, the China-Russia relationship has really warmed up since Xi's rise to power. And although Beijing says that China and Russia are not allies still, they've also explained that there are no restricted areas or upper limits to their partnership. And so if you look at the Xi-Putin sit down and the joint statement that was released by the two leaders after their meeting, you can really see that China and Russia see themselves as strategic partners in pushing back against what they call Western encirclement. And for Russia, that's NATO. And for China, that's the US-led alliance network in the Indo-Pacific region.
So is life always going to be Russia, China, and the United States?
Well, I think these three great powers certainly have outsized influence on developments around the world. But as the current crisis in Ukraine is showing us, other states certainly do count in Ukraine. Ukraine itself, as well as the perspective and interests of major European states, all matter. In Asia, of course, states like Japan and South Korea have a big say, as well as ASEAN states. They all have critical roles in the developments of their region, and they can limit what superpowers can and cannot do. So it's not just the US, China, and Russia, but of course, those are the three great powers in the room that do have a lot of influence on the way things develop.
Your expertise is policy, and I'm thinking of how you watched things in Hong Kong unfold. I'm wondering what you see as the future of Taiwan.
Sure. Well, I think since Xi's rise to power, again, the party has really reinserted itself into all aspects of Chinese life. And I think the party has not been shy about cracking down on protests in Hong Kong or squeezing out any sort of democratic participation on that island. They've really consolidated the CCP's rule, and they've violated essentially the one country, two systems that Hong Kong and the mainland China were supposed to operate under. And so I think this doesn't bode well for Taiwan. Xi Jinping has indeed expressed greater urgency in achieving what he calls reunification with Taiwan. And so that's why many people are very concerned about the situation in the Taiwan Strait, and whether China will be aiming for Taiwan anytime soon, whether they'll be taking military action, or even short of that, there's certainly been an increase in military maneuvers and gray zone tactics in order to intimidate the Taiwanese population and to convince them that there's really no other option but joining the mainland.
You used the phrase, does not bode well. In 5 years, do you think that Taiwan will be another Hong Kong?
So it's hard to predict how things will unfold, but I think given the trends, we're going to see increasing mainland pressure on Taiwan. Having said that, I think many countries, the United States, as well as many of its like-minded partners in the Indo-Pacific region, believe strongly that we need peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, that the Taiwanese people should not be coerced into any sort of arrangement with the mainland. And so I think you've seen moves by countries to really help strengthen Taiwan's position, allow it to defend itself. And I think, it's very clear that if there were to be some sort of military contingency in the Taiwan Strait, the United States wouldn't simply stand by. So I don't see Taiwan just falling into China's orbit anytime soon. I think there would be an outcry.
Yet, we do not have the same kind of alliance with Taiwan as, say, we have with the NATO countries, huh? We don't have that.
Yes, so we don't have an explicit alliance with Taiwan, but the United States, through the Taiwan Relations Act and its decades of engagement with Taiwan, has made very clear that it certainly sees peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait as vital to American interests, vital to the interests of our allies in the region. And so, although we don't have an explicit security commitment, the U.S. has certainly been helping Taiwan with its own defense. And I think the United States, I can't imagine a scenario where China militarily moves on Taiwan and the United States doesn't get involved in some form.
Do you know what that form would be?
Well, I think it'll depend on the situation. And so I think the goal should be not to even get there. We don't want to see a military contingency in the Taiwan Strait. That would be devastating for all of the countries involved. And so I think really strengthening Taiwan's position so that it's able to defend itself, so that China understands that the costs of taking over Taiwan would outweigh any benefits. Making that message clear in advance is much more important.
Is there a Biden foreign policy vis-a-vis China, a clear policy?
So I think the Biden administration's China strategy to date has been structured on two broad efforts. The first is strengthening U.S. allies and partners and networks in order to better compete with China. And the second is establishing a multifaceted relationship with China that includes elements of competition, confrontation when necessary, and of course, cooperation on common interests like climate change or regional challenges like North Korea. I think with regards to the first effort in terms of strengthening U.S. alliances and partnerships, the Biden administration has been quite successful in doing this. We've seen the administration really strengthen the U.S. ROK and U.S.-Japan alliances that had quite a few bumps during the Trump administration. And you've seen the administration really build out multilateral mechanisms like the Quad and establish new ones like the AUKUS, the new security pact between the U.S., Australia, and the UK. Mm-hmm. Where there's been less progress, though, is on establishing a sustainable working relationship with China. And I don't think the fault lies primarily with Washington. I think Beijing has rejected this framework of competing, cooperating, and confronting each other. I think the Chinese government has made clear that Washington shouldn't expect Chinese cooperation on anything as long as the United States continues to challenge its policies elsewhere. So we're still far from sort of a sustainable and predictable and constructive bilateral relationship between the two countries. And I would hope that we'd take more steps to get there this year.
I like asking guests such as yourself as we come down to the end of our time to tell me something about life on a personal level. What's the most important lesson that you've learned in your life so far?
What's the most important lesson I've learned in my life so far? That's a very interesting question. Let's see. So I think, since we're talking about U.S.-China relations, one thing that I've come to realize, especially with this pandemic, is how important people-to-people exchanges are. I think as U.S.-China competition heats up, there's just so much more risk of misunderstanding and sort of misinterpretation of each other's intentions. And so I really think that keeping up sort of the travel, the exchanges between the scholars, the students, people-to-people exchanges is extremely important, and it will help, it really helps create a good foundation for the two countries. And we've really missed out because of the pandemic, as well as political constraints as well. And so that's an area where I hope we can see more progress, which would really help get these two countries toward, again, a more sustainable and transparent and constructive relationship that we'll need to manage, so many, not just our bilateral relationship, but the many problems that our world faces, whether it's health issues like the pandemic or climate change or North Korea's nuclear weapons. There's so much that the two states really need to be working on. And so that's one area where I see great value and where I hope we see more progress.
And we're glad that you're on our team. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for the education and for spending some time with us today. Thank you so much.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Dennis.
For information about This Is America in the World, visit our website, ThisIsAmerica.net, or our YouTube channel, This Is America TV, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Underwriting for This Is America in the World is made possible by the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C., the Republic of Uzbekistan, the Sultanate of Oman, the Kingdom of Morocco, the National Association for Children of Addiction, Faces and Voices of Recovery, the Forerunner Foundation, the Rotendaro Family Trust, and the Embassy Series, Uniting People Through Musical Diplomacy.